Hi everyone, and welcome to this podcast on the efficiency of monetary policies. Just as we did for the fiscal policies, we will use the concept of the multiplier, which will depend on the slopes of IS and LM. Let's start with the short-term income multiplier in the case of an expansionary monetary policy carried out through an open market operation. To calculate the multiplier, we start from the ISLM equations. We differentiate the two equations with respect to the endogenous variables y and r and to the exogenous variable which is shocked, the supply of money. We then express dr as a function of dy in the second equation and then replace dr by this expression in the first equation. We find the expression of the short-term multiplier that you can see here in red. If we look at it closely, what do we learn? We learn that the impact of a monetary policy is indirect. It goes through the interest rate. Look at the term I prime r over L prime r. L prime r measures the effect of the monetary policy on the interest rate, and the term I prime r measures the effect of the variation of the interest rate on the investment. If we look at the denominator now, we can see that the effect on the demand is amplified following the logic of the multiplier. We recognize the same denominator that we had for the fiscal policy. Although the term I prime r times L prime y over L prime r does not mean exactly the same thing as it did before. For the fiscal multiplier, it referred to the crowding out effect. Here, it means that to finance new investment projects, firms must borrow more, and so they increase their demand of loanable funds, which will attenuate the decrease in the interest rate triggered by the monetary policy, and hence discourage new investment projects. In other words, it means that the interest rate decreases less than what it could have under the effect of the monetary policy only. To sum up, the term in the numerator plays the role of an accelerator of demand, and the term in the denominator is a decelerator or an obstacle to the demand. The accelerator is obviously stronger, otherwise the monetary policy would not have any impact. As we learned in the podcast on the fiscal multiplier, we can see that the sensitivity of the money demand with respect to the income, L prime y, and the marginal propensity to save have a role here too, but as we said, they are usually stable parameters in the economy. So the parameters that are of more interest to us here are the sensitivity of the investment to the interest rate and the sensitivity of the money demand to the interest rate. Let's now look at the different impacts of the monetary policy in the short term, depending on the slope of IS and LM, or in other words, depending on the values of I prime r and L prime r. First, let's focus on LM. The flatter LM is, the more the money demand is sensitive to the interest rate. This means that when LM is relatively flat, after an increase in money supply, to come back to the equilibrium on the money market, a small decrease in R will be enough to increase the money demand sufficiently. The effect on investments will be quite low, because the decrease in R would have been quite moderate. Let's take an example. Suppose an economy that's at the point E0. Imagine that the central bank implements an expansionary monetary policy. The LM curve shifts to the right, and the interest rate will decrease. The new equilibrium is at E1, where income has increased from Y0 to Y1. And we can see the decrease in R, which has been low and has allowed the money market to reach back the equilibrium. We can see that the increase in Y allowed thanks to the decrease in R is relatively moderate. Suppose now that the LM curve was much steeper. We start from E0, LM shifts to the right because of the increase in money supply, and the new equilibrium is at E2. We can see that income is higher at E2 than at E1, and the interest rate has decreased more. Indeed, in this case, LM is steeper, so the sensitivity of the money demand to the interest rate is low. So, to come back to the equilibrium on the money market, we need a strong decrease in R to stimulate the money demand for speculative motive, and a high increase in income to stimulate the money demand for transaction motives. Overall, the steeper LM is, the larger the increase in income will be. Let's now look at the elasticity of the investment to the interest rate. So, in other words, at the slope of IS. The steeper IS is, the less the investment is sensitive to the interest rate. Again, we start at E0 with an IS curve that is relatively steep. To come back to the equilibrium on the goods market, we need a large decrease in the interest rate to increase investment and to come back to the equilibrium. The interest rate therefore decreases a lot from R0 to R1, but the impact on investment is limited. The income increases moderately. If we now start from E0, but with an IS curve relatively flat, the decrease in the interest rate necessary to come back to the equilibrium will be quite low because the investment is very sensitive to the interest rate. Yet, this low decrease will trigger a large increase in investment and so in demand. So we see that for the same variation of money supply, the economy will reach E2 with a lower decrease in R, but a higher increase in Y because the investment is very sensitive to the interest rates. Overall, the monetary policy is more efficient if LM is steep, meaning the elasticity of the money demand to the interest rate is low. IS is not so steep, meaning the elasticity of investment to the interest rate is high. We can then describe the cases of maximal efficiency of the monetary policy. It is fully efficient when the investment is infinitely elastic to the interest rate, when IS is horizontal. In this case, when there are downward pressures on the interest rate due to the increase in money supply, the investment increases a lot, and Y increases a lot, which allows to come back to the equilibrium without any variation in R. In other words, the investment is so sensitive that it reacts for an infinitely small decrease in the interest rate. So small that the increase in income is enough to increase the money demand for transaction motives, and so to come back to the equilibrium on the money market. The second case of maximal efficiency is when the money demand is not sensitive at all to the interest rate, when LM is vertical. This is the classical case of neutral money, where the money demand cannot come back to the equilibrium through a variation of the interest rate, because precisely the money demand does not depend on the interest rate. The only thing that can increase the money demand to follow the money supply is an increase in income. This increase is therefore necessarily stronger than in the case where the interest rate also participates to this process of reaching back the equilibrium. Overall, we can see that the multiplier effect is maximal when IS is horizontal and LM is vertical. In the extreme case that combines these two cases, the classical cross, we have a total efficiency of the monetary policy. Once again, remember that we are in the short term here. So we reason at fixed prices and wages. When later on we change these assumptions, these conclusions will be nuanced. We can then symmetrically represent the cases of maximal inefficiency of the monetary policy in the short term. It is inefficient when the money demand is perfectly elastic to the interest rate, when LM is horizontal. Because in the situation of a liquidity trap, the increase in money supply will be completely absorbed without any variation of the interest rate. The agents keep wanting more liquid money, so we say that the money is trapped. The new LM curve is therefore the same as the old one, and the economy does not move. Second case of inefficiency, when the channel of the interest rate does not work. In other words, when the investment is perfectly inelastic to the interest rate. In this case, the interest rate decreases due to the monetary policy, but this does not increase investment, because in this case, investment depends on other factors. So the indirect action of the monetary policy does not work. The multiplier effect will therefore be equal to 0 in the case of the liquidity trap, and in the case of the accelerator effect. Note that if we combine these two cases, we are in the extreme case of the Keynesian cross, and we have a total inefficiency of the monetary policy. Of course, these extreme cases are not usually observed in real life. They constitute a useful analytical framework to conduct macroeconomic analysis. We can use them, for instance, to represent different zones on the ISLM graph. And we can see that in the Keynesian zone, the efficiency is rather low, even 0 in the situation of the Keynesian cross. In the classical zone, the efficiency is rather high, even maximal in the situation of the classical cross. In the intermediary zone, we have partial efficiency of the monetary policy. Once again, remember that here we are in the short term with fixed prices and wages.